Hey guys, Prowl1701 here, and I've been trying to make this video for days, and trying to find the right words to express my opinions on the new trilogy. So I don't necessarily hate it, I just think it fails at what it's setting out to do. I don't think it lives up to the Skywalker saga. I don't think it lives up to the original trilogy. I don't think it lives up to the prequel trilogy. It just... I did my review of Episode 9 recently, and I said I enjoyed the movie. It is. It's a good movie without being a great movie. I constantly said that, by the way, there will be spoilers in this. Heads up, Episode 9 spoilers. There's your warning. I gave it a 7 out of 10. I said it's one of those movies. It's fun if you turn your brain off, but the more you think about it, the more the plot falls apart. And honestly, there's so much going on in the movie. It's like two movies crammed into one. Like Abrams wanted to do his 8 and 9 and cram them into one. And I honestly think the movie knows that it doesn't quite make sense plot-wise in places, but it keeps you moving so fast on purpose that you don't have time to think about it. And the crap, is the Emperor shooting electricity out and frying all the shit? Oh, look, there's Wedge! I love Wedge! I do love Wedge. Little things like that where as soon as you start thinking about it, something's going on. Look, here's Londo, stop thinking about it. And that's more of an Episode 9 complaint. But there's a lot of... I think Episode 7 started off pretty well. I know it's kind of a rehash of 4 in places. And we're going bigger is better with we can destroy multiple planets now. But it did a good job of setting up Episode 8. And left it right at a good spot for 8 to pick up. And I would have loved to have seen Abrams 8. At least I say that. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of J.J. Abrams in general. I think the best movie I've ever seen him do was probably his 2009 Star Trek. And then he did Into Darkness, and I thought that was terrible. At least the second half of it was terrible. First half was pretty good. So yeah, Episode 7 that pretty much goes this one direction, sets up a lot of this stuff. Then Rian Johnson comes in, takes one look at that, and goes, nope. I want to do this. And then, after he erases the chalkboard, he writes his own formula on the chalkboard, and we get Episode 8, which somehow some Star Wars fans like. Somehow. And don't get me wrong, if you like Last Jedi, that's cool. I'm not saying my opinion's better than yours. I'm just saying, as someone who's been a Star Wars fan longer than I have living memory and spend $300 on lightsaber replicas and have over a dozen of them still, I don't get it. I don't get it. The movie has good moments. It's just, it has a lot of really stupid moments. And it ignores certain things like physics. When it I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a Star Wars movie about a ship traveling faster in light. In space, while they shoot lasers that go slower than light because I can see them go. Which always makes me wonder if a ship traveling in space at the speed of light fires lasers that travel slower than that while they're in hyperspace, wouldn't they blow themselves up? These are the kind of things I think about when I'm at home and the power goes out. But... The Last Jedi it did too many different things. And don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those people that's against Rian Johnson doing a Star Wars movie. I actually wouldn't mind seeing Rian Johnson do a Star Wars movie, because there's nothing wrong with subverting expectations. Empire Strikes Back did that. I mean, think about it. We had the big battle at the beginning of the movie instead of the end. Right there, barely into the movie. Great battle. Great scene. Some people call that the best battle scene in Star Wars. And it's at the beginning. It took a much darker tone. It got very personal. The whole twist with Vader. It took a lot of chances. There's nothing wrong with doing that. I just didn't want him to do it with these established characters. I would have rather Rian Johnson had done a spin-off movie or one of these new movies like he's still supposed to be doing with new characters. Because once you start turning things on their head with characters that people have loved for 40 years... you're going to piss a lot of people off. I mean, there are some people who like that. They like, oh, look what they did with Luke. They took that in a different direction. The books didn't do that. There's a reason why a lot of people like the books. Is because the direction the books went, people liked. The extended universe is very popular. It's why a lot of people were pissed off when Disney looked at the extended universe and went, nope. So episode 8 has some good scenes. I actually like the Luke Skywalker stuff with episode 8. I didn't the first time I watched it, but it doesn't bother me as much now. And I actually think his scene on Crate at the end is one of the best scenes in Star Wars. It's beautifully shot. Mark Hamill acts it perfectly. I'll say this for Rian Johnson. He can shoot a beautiful movie. It just has a lot of dumb ideas. The scene when he's talking with R2-D2 and seeing the message of Leia from A New Hope, beautiful scene. But after that movie came out, a lot of people didn't like it. It was divisive. Disney's not stupid. They're like, what can we do to save our butts? Let's get Abrams back. They love Abrams. They like The Force Awakens. Let's keep in mind, one of the reasons episode 8 was probably so different is because people complained episode 7 was too much like A New Hope. So they overcorrected their steer and went way off in this direction. Unfortunately, with Rise of Skywalker, they overcorrected again. They're just in a skid they can't get out of. And they went back to too much fan service, which is good fan service. I love the stuff. When Luke raises that X-Wing out of the water, I love that. Seeing Wedge for a second, yes. I mean, there were great moments for me. But still, I need plot. And I don't need it all crammed in. I would have rather them just split Rise of Skywalker into 2 movies and said, all right, we admit it, we screwed up, we're giving y'all an extra movie. But they can't do that because heaven forbid somebody in Hollywood admit they screwed up something. And so say, you know what? We've decided to make it 2 movies because it's got to be a trilogy. And that comes to the main problem of why the sequels fail. I know that's a long way to get there, but it was J.J. Abrams going up to the chalkboard, erasing everything Rian Johnson did, or at least most of it, putting a lot of his stuff back on there, although he found out he had to incorporate some of what Rian Johnson did and work around that. And the main problem is, and other people have said this, I'm right there, I'm not the first person to point this out by far, is that there's no consistency. You can very easily tell that there was not a rough outline in place of where they were going with these movies. And say what you want about the original trilogy or even the prequels, but you always had this idea that George had an idea. Now, some things might have been up for debate he might not have been sure of, but he had in his mind at least a rough outline of a beginning, a middle, and an end for even the prequels. You cannot say that the prequels don't feel like a beginning, a middle, and an end. Maybe episode 3 is a little rushed. It has a lot it has to do, much like Rise of Skywalker. But, and I will tell this to you, Revenge of the Sith pulls off what it has to do and the time it has to do it better than Rise of Skywalker. Revenge of the Sith is just a better movie than Rise of Skywalker because it actually has a story and a plot that mostly makes sense. Yes, it has its flaws. The turn is way too fast and easy. But again, they only have so much time they have to do it. And I think it utilizes its time better than Rise of Skywalker. Revenge of the Sith never feels crowded to me. It feels like even though there's a lot going on, there's a reason for it going on. The pacing never feels off to me. It's the only Star Wars movie I can watch anymore that I don't fast forward through something. The original trilogy, I do it just because I've seen them a million times. I finally watched the 4Ks the other day, and all 3 of the original trilogy, I was fast forwarding through something. The only movie I can watch in Star Wars and not hit the fast forward button is Revenge of the Sith, a prequel movie. Because there's always something going on. There's nothing that bores me, but it never feels crowded, rushed, and bloated like Rise of Skywalker does when they're... But it has... So the prequel trilogy does feel like one vision from one creator, George Lucas. You can tell that all 3 of the movies were done by one guy who knew what he wanted to do, for the most part, going into each one. He had the overall arc he was trying to get to, just like he did with the original trilogy. Whereas these 3 movies, the sequel trilogy, one person came up with something to set up for somebody else. They did something totally different, and then the first person came back, because they were in panic mode at that point, and then completely turned it around again. So you have Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams, and then Colin, the guy who was originally supposed to do episode 9, all playing tug of war with Star Wars, all trying to pull it these different ways. And that's probably why Colin got fired. They didn't like what he was trying to do with it. And so, instead of having this meeting of the minds where they sit down and work this stuff out, each movie feels like it's going in a different direction, and it's very obvious. And that should have been Common Sense 101. Not that I accuse Hollywood, or Americans in general, of common sense now, but that's something, when you're dealing with a franchise, this kind of money, that kind of money's involved with, and with that kind of fan base, especially because most fan bases are toxic these days. I mean, the internet's huge now. It's not like it was even in the prequels times. It's so much bigger. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody has a voice. Everybody's going to find a fault with something. You're never going to make something that's universally loved by everybody, usually. Every now and then, everybody seems to love Joker for the most part. But it's very seldom to get that kind of generally awesome consensus. Especially with something like Star Wars. There's always going to be people who don't care for it. I'm not a big Rogue One fan. I don't hate it, but I'm not a big fan of it. It just seemed unnecessary. Plus, I felt like it erased Kyle Katarn, and I love Kyle Katarn. I'm a big fan of the EU. Going back to the EU, one of my closest friends who's in some of my videos with me is my friend Ian. And the interesting dynamic in our friendship is there's a generation gap between us, because I'm in my mid-30s now, and he's 19. So it's interesting to have one of my closest friends with that kind of age gap, but it's neat to see how we look at things differently. Like even the franchises we have in common, and then like Transformers, Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who, and see like in Doctor Who the type of doctors, what we like in a doctor more. Like he's a much bigger Peter Capaldi fan than I am, whereas he's also a much bigger William Hartnell fan than I am, because Hartnell's a lot like Capaldi. Whereas I'm a much bigger fan of other classic doctors, because he's not as familiar with them. And like Matt Smith, I think I like Matt Smith more than he does, because Matt does more of what I like in a doctor, because he kind of reminds me of some of the sillier doctors like Tom and Patrick. Very much Patrick, because Matt's a huge fan of Patrick. And even like Transformers, how we look at Transformers differently. I don't like the live action movies, whereas he'll admit they're not perfect, but they were what got him into Transformers. So they have that nostalgia, magic for him, where I was in my 20s when they came out, and I knew almost immediately. I was like, ooh. So it's interesting with Star Wars, because he was born the same year I was graduating high school. And he's never read a lot of the Extended Universe books. And for Christmas this year, I bought him Heir to the Empire, because I've always wanted him to read that trilogy, because I think it's one of the best pieces of Star Wars fiction ever written. I have basically a trinity of Star Wars that are the holy grails for me. The best written, the top of the line. That's the original trilogy, the Thrawn trilogy, which is Heir to the Empire, Dark Force Rising, and The Last Command. Timothy Zahn's trilogy that pretty much started the sequel books that created the Extended Universe, and Knights of the Old Republic. I think these are the best Star Wars things ever done, with KOTOR 2 being just barely below that. Those are easily my favorite things in Star Wars. I just finished a playthrough of Knights of the Old Republic just yesterday, and I still love that game. I still love that story. It's got a twist that rivals Empire Strikes Back. It might not best it, but it's certainly as good as it. I'll fight to the death on that one. But I've been wanting him to read these books, because he hates the sequel. I won't say necessarily the sequel movies. He hates Last Jedi. He flat out hates Last Jedi. But he's also, like I am, he's very disappointed with the sequel trilogy as a whole. It doesn't do what it should. It doesn't live up to the legacy of these characters. They deserve better. They had happy endings with Episode 6, and then you take that away from them, especially bringing Palpatine back. That completely diminishes Anakin's moment at the end of 6. And makes it less. And makes their victory in Episode 6 less. And when your sequel movies start hurting the original trilogy, you have failed. You have failed. Your sequel trilogy has failed, and you have failed your fans. Because the original trilogy is, what we hold up there. That's our number one. Everything revolves around it. So when something you do in your Star Wars movie somehow lessens something in one of those movies, you failed.